So this lecture, lecture 6 is on the efferent circuits. We'll take a look at those. So here are your key takeaways, the learning objectives. You have some additional resources. You could take a look at these videos here that are useful. You will notice by the table of contents, I'll give you a brief overview of the efferent nervous system, but then it really breaks down into two very separate parts, and they're separate neurons, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. They really are their own set of neurons, and they do different things, okay? So again, the overview of the efferent nervous system, this efferent, E means exiting, right? Efferent starts with an E, so exiting. Afferent meant to arrive to the CNS. Now we're exiting the CNS, efferent, okay? And so this is outgoing motor signals causing a change in an effector. So these are signals that are going down to move or squeeze something, okay? It's doing something. So what is an effector? An effector is a cell or tissue that acts in response to a stimulus. The effector is that target cell, right, where we're going to. And effectors could be categorized in two ways. We could have voluntary effectors, and this is really skeletal muscle, right? Remember, we had three types of muscle. The skeletal ones are on the skeleton of the body, and they allow us to voluntarily move. So look at this neuron exiting the spinal cord and going on to this skeletal muscle. This could be your biceps muscle, your quadriceps. You can ask that muscle to contract. Maybe it's the muscles involved in mastication when you eat. All of these you're in control of, right? So this is a voluntary effector because you voluntarily can control it. This branch is part of the somatic nervous system. Okay, that's the first part we're going to see. The other type of effector you could have is an involuntary effector. Involuntary means you're not voluntarily controlling it, right? You're not in control of this. Smooth muscle is, you see coming out the spinal cord, we go to the smooth muscle. Think of the smooth muscle around your stomach. I can't ask you right now to squeeze your stomach, right? That's because smooth muscle is an involuntary effector. We don't have control over it. Smooth muscle is also in our esophagus, right? Squeezing down the food. So all of these things you're not in control of. A lot of your visceral organs have smooth muscle around it. But if you can control it, then it's skeletal muscle. If you can't control it, it's probably a smooth muscle. It could also be a cardiac muscle. I don't think, please come see me if you can do this. I don't think you can squeeze your heart chambers, right? I can't ask you right now to squeeze your heart chambers. That's not in your control. It's involuntary, okay? And lastly, glands, sweat glands, salivary glands, right? We're not in control of those. So that's an involuntary effector. Again, all of these three are part of the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. We're not in control of this part of the nervous system. This is automatic, right? Saliva ejects automatically. You can't salivate on cue, right? You can't sweat on cue. I don't think we're in control of that. So all of these are some examples that we have for involuntary effectors. And as I said, the lecture is split in two. We're going to see the voluntary effectors, the SNS, somatic nervous system, and then we'll see the involuntary autonomic nervous system. So first, the somatic nervous system. Again, here you see the neuron exiting the spinal cord. This motor neuron sends its axon, and then we're going to see that it's going to skeletal muscle, right? And it's releasing some acetylcholine onto this skeletal muscle. Over here, you see the neuron in the autonomic nervous system exiting. It actually synapses in a ganglia, we'll see later. And it goes onto, you see this tube here? Maybe this is the tube of the esophagus or the stomach, right? This is smooth muscle. These muscles are smooth muscle, and they release their neurotransmitter onto smooth muscle to contract it. So again, in the somatic nervous system, we have skeletal muscle, but in the autonomic nervous system, what are we synapsing on? We're releasing this neurotransmitter onto either smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. Those are the three things I need you to know. Release, neurotransmitter is released through a synapse onto an effector. You see that here at the end, at the synaptic terminals, right, we're releasing neurotransmitter onto this muscle over here. Here, neurotransmitter is released through a postganglionic varicosity onto an effector. Here, the neuron at the ends, do you see how it has little bumps, little bulges of neurotransmitter? Those are called varicosities, and they release their neurotransmitter onto the smooth muscle, but there's many varicosities all across. So actually, you could kind of stimulate all this muscle all together at once. Then the type of control over here, this is voluntary, right? Somatic, this is a skeletal muscle. You are in control of the muscles on your skeleton. Whereas here, these autonomic nervous system, this is an involuntary control. You're not in control of these muscles, these smooth muscles that are contracting. This is involuntary, okay? And then the number of neurons, here I want you to see that in the somatic nervous system, from the spinal cord, the CNS, one neuron exits and it goes directly to the target, the skeletal muscle. Like let's say it's going to your bicep, it's just going to be one motor neuron, one multipolar neuron exiting from the spinal cord out. Whereas in the autonomic system, it's a 2-neuron system. You have one neuron exiting. Its synapses here in the ganglia. This is called the sympathetic ganglia, not the dorsal root ganglia, the sympathetic ganglia. And then it sends another neuron. You don't really see it well, but we're going to see it in the coming slides. In the autonomic system, it synapses onto another neuron that sends out its projection onto the actual organ. Okay? So let's start with this. As I said, the somatic nervous system, then we'll deal with the autonomic one. So the SNS, the somatic nervous system, I'm just going to say right now, for the efferent nervous system in general, for motor commands, either this one or the autonomic, they always start in your CNS. They start up high. We make our decisions to move up in our CNS, in our brain or spinal cord. That's where we make the decision to move, right? So it starts there. Sensory, it started in the periphery and it went up. But now we're starting up in the brain, or mostly the brain or the spinal cord, and then we're going back down, okay? So we start in the cerebral cortex for the SNS, then we go to spinal and cranial nerves, and then we release our neurotransmitter onto our effectors. So here you see, I'm going to start in the cerebral cortex. This is where I'm going to initiate a motor plan. So where do motor signals originate? Motor association areas, they make a motor plan, right? Remember we said motor association area made a plan, oh, I need to move my arm to grab the side of the bed, right? And that sends a neuron to primary motor cortex. We don't see this in this picture very well, but we saw that in the functional areas of the brain. Then we go to primary motor cortex. And then in primary motor cortex, right, let's say I said that in primary motor cortex, we go and we trigger each of the skeletal muscles separately, right? So maybe I'm moving my arm, so this muscle over here in the hand is going to move, so it'll send a neuron down and trigger just the hand part, right? And maybe my elbow muscle near my elbow will move, so I trigger this neuron, and then I go down to that part. If I'm not moving my face, then these neurons won't fire, right? But basically in primary motor cortex, I send it down. This is important because a somatic nervous system is voluntary. And remember, I kept repeating this. If it's a voluntary movement, it must come from up in the brain, in the cerebral cortex, right? Voluntary things are in the cortex, okay? It's not starting in the brainstem. I'm voluntary conscious about my movement. It needs to come up here. In the autonomic system, this will be different because it's automatic and we won't be voluntarily in control of it. I need you to know that motor signals are also contralateral. Just like sensory signals, motor signals also cross to the opposite side of the body. Do you see this is in the patient's left hemisphere, right? They send down their fibers and then eventually they actually cross and then they go to the other side. So this part of the cortex on the left hemisphere will control the left hand or the left part of the face or the left foot, okay? If I was in the right hemisphere, I would be controlling my left leg, my left arm, my left part of the face, okay? So I need you to know that they are contralateral. The part of the brain that processes the motor command and sends the signal down reaches the other side of the body, okay? So now that means that at some point in the CNS they cross, right? These fibers cross. I don't need you to know when or where they cross, but I do need you to know that it could either be in the medulla, which most of them cross at. You see actually over here, we go down, 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 and in the medulla, this is the medulla oblongata, we actually cross over to the other side, right? But actually sometimes, right, they could cross in the midbrain, the pons, or the spinal cord. So look at this here, my neurons come down and they cross in the spinal cord here, right? So I just need you to know it could be the medulla or these other regions that they cross. Basically, you need to understand that they do cross over. There is a crossing over of information because it's contralateral. What does contralateral mean? Lateral means to the side, right? And contra means contrary. So you're on the whatever side of the cortex is the contrary lateral side to what's moving. So if I send things from my right hemisphere, it'll go down to the left part of the body. If I send things from the right hemisphere, it'll go down to the left part of the body. Okay? So that was the cerebral cortex. I initiate a motor plan. I tell which muscles need to contract, and then I send an axon down through these brainstem structures. But now, if the motor information travels down to a body part below the head or neck, the neuron will exit the spinal cord, right? This is just like the afferent information, because over here, my neurons were coming down, and if they move something below the neck, well, they'll need to travel down the spinal cord first and then exit, right? And we have 62 spinal nerves. We have 31 spinal nerve pairs. So if, again, I'm moving my arm, it won't make sense to exit my neuron out in the brain, right? I need to actually go down the spinal cord and then exit out through one of these spinal nerves, okay? Now, if the motor information travels down to the head or neck, right? This is an entire course dedicated to you. This neuron will most likely exit the brain directly via one of the 24 cranial nerves, okay? So let's say this is movement to move my facial muscles to make facial expressions. There's no point in sending this neuron down all the way down the spinal cord if I'm exiting out at the facial level, right? I could just exit out one of these regions in the brain itself, right? The brainstem is an easier passage. So basically we've seen this before, but based on what skeletal muscle you're moving, you're gonna either go out in the spinal nerves, or if it's above the neck, it's much easier to just exit out a cranial nerve that's one of these 12, right? So again, you kind of see this here. Like, let's say I'm moving my, eye muscles, right? Well, my motor neurons will exit out in the brainstem over here through a cranial nerve, right? But if I'm going to move something lower, like my leg or my abdominal muscles, then I'm going to go and exit out of the spinal cord to go to those skeletal muscles, right? It's just a matter of location, what's easiest to get to. So I started in the cortex, I went out a spinal or cranial nerve, and now I'm going to synapse onto an effector. So let me resume what happens. The cell body of the first neuron is in the primary motor cortex. So here's primary motor cortex, right? And I send my neuron down. The signals will go down and send, I decide to finally move, right? We know that before this, there's actually the motor association area that talks to this neuron. This neuron signals down and it sends a signal to a multipolar neuron, another multipolar neuron, which is called a motor neuron. This last neuron that actually talks to the muscle is called a motor neuron. So here, our other neuron, right? It synapses with this one that came down, and it exits out, right? It has its cell body in the brainstem, and it exits out to the skeletal muscle. Or, this would be an example of a cranial nerve. Maybe this neuron really goes lower, and this motor neuron, right, exits out at this level of the spinal cord. But this is our motor neuron, right? The one that's going to the muscle to do the contracting. And as I said, here the nuclei, it could be in the diencephalon. Here you see it in the brainstem, right? Here you see it in the spinal cord. It could be at different levels depending on where that skeletal muscle is. And so, as I said, the motor neuron extends its axon into the PNS, and its axon terminals synapse onto the skeletal muscle. You see that the terminals are on a skeletal muscle. Maybe this is your biceps, maybe this is your mastication muscles to chew. And these terminals, right, they release the neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, we saw this last year. It's what gets released onto the muscle to contract the muscle, right? So it's released onto the skeletal muscle cells, causing contraction. Now, that was it for the SNS. Very simple, easy peasy. Now we go to the autonomic nervous system, which is a little bit more complicated, but not too bad either. So SNS was stuff we're in control of. This autonomic nervous system, we are not in control of. This is not under our voluntary control. It's involuntary. So the autonomic nervous division controls involuntary activities like your organ functions, gland secretion, smooth muscle contraction in two separate states. Do you see here, I blanked it out. We have the motor efferent division composed of motor neurons, right, that conduct signals from the CNS to the effectors. We had the somatic nervous system that this controls your voluntary movements. And then you have the autonomic nervous system. This controls involuntary responses that we're not in control of, okay? So this is what we're going to look at, and there's two branches. There's this fight or flight sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division. So sympathetic is when you're in a state of stress, you need to mobilize the body systems to fight and to flight away from the tiger that's running after you. So this is often called the fight or flight, right? You're trying to get all your heartbeat ready, your breathing rate, your glucose in your blood so that you have enough energy to fight off this thing. The parasympathetic, right? So S is for stress, sympathetic. Parasympathetic, this is the rest and digest. When you're not running away from the tiger, you want to rest to recover your tissues. Think of it evolutionarily. These animals, the little, little squirrel running away from a big animal that's trying to eat it. And then once maybe it hurt itself as it was trying to run away, right? Well, now it wants to rest and digest. It wants to regain the nutrients so that it's ready to run away from something if ever it comes back later on. So it conserves energy, right? So this is really the repairing of tissues and and trying to get ready for the next battle that comes your way, the next stressor that comes. These are the two branches of the autonomic division, and we're not really in control of these. I'll show you how that is. So again, sympathetic division, this is the fight or flight, is responsible for heightened metabolic episodes, increasing metabolism in a dangerous situation, intensely stressful events, and during exercise. You know this. When something scary is happening, maybe someone's running after you and coming for you and you don't know what's going on, you're in a haunted house, your heart rate goes up, you start sweating, right? These are not in your control. It's the sympathetic division. The parasympathetic, right, when you're sitting on a rock in the middle of the ocean, meditating, this is the rest and digest response. It's activated when danger is not imminent and stress is low. So in this case, again, this is so that you could recuperate from that stressful event that's there. So I need to talk about those two branches, right? Sympathetic and parasympathetic branches antagonize each other. What does this mean? Antagonize, an antagonist or this means goes against, right? There's an agonist, which is helps to increase. An antagonist is something that fights with the other thing. An antagonist, I think they use that in movie terminology or books, like the bad guy, right? The bad guy fighting with the good guy. So that's an antagonizing effect to their fighting. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic division typically antagonize each other. Most organs are actually what we call dually innervated. There's actually one sympathetic nerve that goes to it. Actually, there's more than one, and a separate pair of parasympathetic nerves. So I'll give you an example here. Do you see the heart? The brain, it sends this parasympathetic nerve to the heart to say, slow down, right? Rest your heart. So when you're sitting on a rock and you're, meditating, your heart rate goes down. This parasympathetic is really firing fast and saying, slow down. At the same time, right, you also have sympathetic nerves going there. So here's my sympathetic neurons, and they also synapse on the heart. And what does the sympathetic nerve say? Remember, this is the stress response. It says, go, 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 fire faster, right? Beat faster. So do you see these two neurons are both synapsing on the heart, but they're giving it totally different directives. One is saying, go, 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 and the other is saying slow down, right? So both of these are actually antagonizing each other. They're fighting with each other to try to control the heart. Both divisions, they're continually activated and they counter each other's effects on the organ until one branch fires more rapidly and ends up predominating. So, for example, when you're running away from the tiger, both of these are firing their action potentials onto the heart. But when you run away from the tiger, this sympathetic branch fires more action potentials quickly, and so it dominates. And therefore, this parasympathetic nerve is shut up a bit and doesn't fire as fast. So your heartbeat ends up going quicker, right? The other way around, when you're sitting on a rock calm, you have this parasympathetic nerve that's sending its neuron out, and it will fire a lot when you're in this relaxing state, and it'll fire onto this heart and slow down the rate of the heartbeats, right? Whereas the sympathetic will shut up and not send as many action potentials. So here you see that, it's not that one neuron fires or the other one does. They're both firing, but they're fighting together. And the one that's the loudest wins that's the one that takes over and does the job more, right? So here you see that in a sympathetic, when the snake is coming at you, there's more firing of the sympathetic and a bit less firing of the parasympathetic. When you're resting and digesting, your parasympathetic will go up and your sympathetic will go down. When you're resting, your heart rate really goes down. When you're scared, your heart rate goes up, right? So that's an example of just one organ and how the sympathetic and parasympathetic, they fight each other, they antagonize each other. An exception. Some effectors are actually only innervated by the sympathetic system, and they just decrease the activity of their firing over time. Don't worry too much about this for now, but there are some that just have one of the branches going to it, but most of them are dually innervated actually. So I want to take some time to take a look at this because this is what's important, okay? The sympathetic division dilates your pupils. When you are in a stressed, you want to open up your pupil to allow as much light in so that you could see the dangers coming to you. When you're resting, you want to constrict the pupil so that not much light comes in. When you are stressed, you want to inhibit saliva production. It's not time to digest. It's time to run away from the tiger. So stop digesting, stop putting saliva, right? When we're stressed, we could sometimes feel our mouth get a bit dry, right? This is why. And we feel thirsty a bit because we're inhibiting our saliva production, right? Whereas over here, right, the parasympathetic stimulates saliva production. When we're resting, we see food, we start salivating, right? That's rest and digest. Your bronchi, the airway passages here, they will dilate. They will get bigger because when you're stressed, in the sympathetic, you want to allow a lot of air to come into the lungs so that you're ready with oxygen. When you're resting, you'll actually constrict them a bit and you won't need as much air going. You're calm, your heart is beating less fast, so you could afford that less oxygen. You're not moving as much, so you don't need that oxygen in parasympathetic. In sympathetic, your heart rate accelerates. It goes faster because you need to get that blood to all of the tissues that's trying to help you to run away. All your muscles need that blood to it. Whereas in the parasympathetic, your heart rate will slow down and beat at a slower rate to try to allow you to relax. Your adrenal glands stimulate epinephrine and norepinephrine release, which that we're going to see in a bit, but that's trying to, we're going to see all the effects of these hormones later on. And it stimulates glucose release from the liver so that you could have all of this glucose ready in your blood to burn down as you're running away during cellular respiration. Your muscles are going to need a lot of energy, so we'll see that glucose. While we're running away from the tiger in the sympathetic branch, we want to inhibit all our digestive organs. We pause them. It's not time to contract our stomach to digest, right? So people with like who are chronically stressed, oftentimes they have constipation as a symptom because this is their sympathetic trying to stop their digestive tract from doing its job, right? Over here you see that it stimulates stomach, pancreas, and intestines in the parasympathetic, right? This is the rest and digest, parasympathetic. When it's time to relax, you want to digest and go and do this. In the sympathetic, we want to inhibit urination. It's not time to pee while you're running from the tiger, right? It's actually time to get your shit together and run away. So it inhibits urination. When we're truly in a stressful position and we're in the midst of it, oftentimes we really do try to inhibit, like we're not thinking of peeing while we're in a stressful position. Some people will tell me, yes, but I like a nervous pee like before something. I think that's mostly an anticipation to a stressor. but not necessarily while you're in it. I don't think you would really be thinking of that if something was chasing you. So I counter that argument. And in the parasympathetic, this is when we can urinate more, when we're in this rest and digest state. Over here for the genitalia, in the sympathetic, this is a reproductive function, so ejaculation and vaginal contractions, they are promoted in sympathetic because activity, right, and exercising is part of this branch as well. And so when they're in reproductive mode, needing a lot of energy, right, they will want to reproduce their organisms, whereas over here in the rest and digest promotes other factors of the genitalia. We don't need to worry too much about this. This is not our field in dental hygiene. So I've tried to really summarize the main things over here that are important for us. So you could take a look at this. These are the main findings that we find in the sympathetic, what happens in the parasympathetic for every organ. Remember, what I need you to remember is that the branches antagonize each other. Some neurons send out their neurons to, let's say, the salivary glands and tell it to inhibit saliva. Some neurons go out to the salivary glands, other neurons, right, and tell the salivary glands to make saliva. Both neurons are constantly firing, but when you're stressed, these neurons fire faster and win over the signal. And when you're resting, these neurons, parasympathetic, they fire faster and win over, okay? So that's the antagonizing effect that we see. All right, so next thing. We've already kind of dealt with this, but I want to put a name to it. So what is autonomic tone? Autonomic tone is the balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic activity at rest during homeostasis. As you're just sitting here right now, right, unless you're on a treadmill or you're meditating on a rock, when you're just normally going around out and about in your day, the autonomic tone of an organ is really that balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic at rest, when you're just in neutral position. You're not actively trying to be meditating, you're not actively running, you're neutral, right? So physiological values describing the autonomic tone of a dually innervated organ is determined by both divisions. I'll give you an example of what I mean. This resting heart rate, right now, as if you're not on the treadmill, you could measure your heart rate, and your resting heart rate is generally 70 to 80 beats per minute, okay? So what produces this value? Why is it 70 to 80 beats per minute? That's because the heart has these sympathetic neurons that go to it and tell it to beat fast, right? So these are the sympathetic neurons that say, go, 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 beat faster. And it also has these parasympathetic neurons that go to it and say, whoa, slow down the heart rate. And both of these are firing neurons constantly. Both of these are firing neurotransmitter onto this heart constantly and telling it to go fast, slow down. It's really like mixed messages that these organs get, right? But this heart, in the end, when you're at rest, the signals from both of these end up having you at 70 to 80 beats per minute, depending on the person. So this is called the autonomic tone. The fact that we have, at rest, we have a certain value that our heart is at, right? And that's due to the two branches. I could also say the same thing for, breathing rate, right? The breathing rate has an autonomic tone of, I don't know how many breaths per minute, right? Because the sympathetic and parasympathetic are fighting and they're telling your lungs to breathe at a certain rate. So that's what autonomic tone is. It's like a tone of your muscle, right? Like at rest, you have a muscle tone. a certain stretch of your muscle, while at rest you have a certain autonomic tone of your organs that are going at a certain rate or a certain physiological value to of contraction, right? So that was an overview of the autonomic nervous system. Now we need to look at where it starts and where it ends, kind of like the SNS. So we're going to look at the origin of the signal, the neurons, and then the neurotransmitters. How are signals sent in the ANS? The neurons in the ANS, they don't start in the cerebral cortex because their voluntary commands would start in the cortex. That would be somatic nervous system that would start in the cerebral cortex. Instead, these signals, they start in the hypothalamus, which is in the diencephalon. The hypothalamus has some neurons and they send them out to their effectors, right? They're sending it out to the effectors. So the hypothalamus is what sends these motor signals from the brain. They'll send it down to the brainstem, or they could send it down to the spinal cord. Secondly, a neuron from the hypothalamus sends a signal to a neuron in the brainstem over here, or it could go down to the spinal cord. Again, same situation. If I am going to things that are a little bit higher up, right? I could exit the brainstem over here, or things lower, I could go in the spinal cord. So they send either to these, and they synapse these purple neurons, right? They synapse onto these motor neurons. And remember I told you in the autonomic nervous system, we have a 2-neuron system. Do you see this red neuron exiting and then a black neuron? Here you see a red neuron and a black neuron, right? That's because there's a 2-neuron system. Over here you have the red neuron symbolizes the preganglionic neuron that leaves the CNS to communicate to a final neuron. The final neuron in black over here, actually, this is called the postganglionic neuron. So we have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron, because over here when an autonomic signal leaves, right, these preganglionic neurons, they synapse in what we call the autonomic ganglia. The autonomic ganglia are remember what ganglia means? It's a bunch of cell bodies, collections of cell bodies that are where in the PNS, right? So the preganglionic neuron synapses onto this, and then a postganglionic neuron exits to go to the effector. Here you see a preganglionic neuron exiting, and it goes on to a postganglionic neuron over here, okay? And it goes to the visceral effector. I don't know if I could find, here I've symbolized it by 2 neurons as well, right? These 2 neurons. I want to go and find over here as well. You see that there's 1 neuron and 2 neurons. 1 neuron and 2 neurons, right? Let me see where else I had this. You don't see that over here in the SNS. Here you only had this 1 neuron that was exiting the brainstem, or 1 neuron exiting the spinal cord, right? I want to go here though. Here, the somatic, you saw from the spinal cord, 1 neuron exit. Here you see 2. You see 1 neuron exit, synapse in the ganglia, and another neuron exiting, synapsing onto the effector. So let's go back. This is our little layout that we have. The last neuron, this black neuron here that's exiting, that's called the postganglionic, because it's post, it's after the ganglia. This is pre, the red one is pre of the ganglia, right? The last one, the postganglionic neuron, synapses onto the target effector. So the effector is involuntary, right? It could be smooth muscle, it could be glands, it could be cardiac muscle, or it could be adipocytes, fat cells, right? Don't worry about fat cells. We don't really talk about those, but these are the things that we can control in a non-voluntary way, involuntary way, right? So we communicate onto effectors via our postganglionic neurons, mostly with the neurotransmitters epinephrine, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine. These neurons, the black ones, they will release one of these three neurotransmitters onto their targets. Okay, so I just want to re-emphasize a certain part. The ANS is a 2-neuron system between the CNS and the effector. So over here you have the CNS. This could be the spinal cord or the brainstem. The neuron exits, that's your preganglionic neuron, releases neurotransmitter onto another neuron. And then this neuron is the postganglionic neuron that goes to the target tissue, the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or gland. This thing here is called the autonomic ganglia because this is a group of cell bodies in the PNS. You only see one cell body here, but actually many neurons are going to synapse onto this ganglia here. So the preganglionic neuron, it connects the CNS to the ganglia. The cell body is in the CNS and the terminals are in the PNS in this ganglia. The postganglionic neuron here connects the ganglion with the effector, and it's found entirely in the PNS, right? We're all in the PNS here. All right, so last thing are the neurotransmitters and their receptors. How does a neurotransmitter cause different effects, right? So neurotransmitters cause graded potentials that are excitatory or inhibitory. However, a single neurotransmitter could cause blood vessels in one part of the body to constrict, but in another part of the body, it could dilate it, right? So how does this happen? The response of an effector depends on the receptor the neurotransmitter binds to. So basically, effectors, right, they receive input from many synapses and they can respond to more than one type of neurotransmitter. So the effector, right, let's say whatever this target tissue is, let's say it's the heart, right? The heart could have some receptors that are going to receive signals from these cholinergic synapses or from the adrenergic. They could have both actually, right? So I just want us to get our terminology together and then we will go and see what this means. So, all right. Over here, right, effectors receive input from many. So cholinergic synapses, choline, right, sounds like acetylcholine. So neurotransmitters released at the synapse is acetylcholine. When we have a neuron that releases acetylcholine, we call this cholinergic. Okay, this is a cholinergic neuron and this is a cholinergic synapse, and we don't see them here, we're going to have some cholinergic receptors. Adrenergic synapses, adrenaline, right, it sounds like adrenaline, release the neurotransmitters norepinephrine and epinephrine. Norepinephrine, another name for this, is called noradrenaline. Okay, epinephrine, another name for it is adrenaline. Okay, so the neurotransmitter released at the synapse is either going to be norepinephrine or epinephrine. It could be both actually at times. So these neurotransmitters, they could also be called adrenaline and noradrenaline. These are adrenergic synapses, versus these were cholinergic acetylcholine synapses. And why am I introducing this? Because organs that are dually innervated by sympathetic and parasympathetic typically contain both of these synapses that'll tell them to do different things. Okay, so here is my crazy chart, but let's go through it slowly. What you have here is neuronal connections in the ANS. So all preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. Let's see this. I want to first look at the somatic nervous system. Remember skeletal muscle contracting your biceps? This was the first part of the lecture. You see that the cell bodies, this is trying to mimic like the central nervous system, the spinal cord. The cell bodies are here, they exit the spinal cord, and they release acetylcholine onto skeletal muscle. So somatic nervous systems have these cholinergic synapses. This is a cholinergic neuron that releases acetylcholine. And so this is a cholinergic synapse, and this will excite things, okay? Here, in the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, remember we have the sympathetic branch or the parasympathetic branch, right? In the sympathetic branch, a neuron, forget about this for now. The neuron exits the spinal cord, goes to a ganglia, a grouping of cell bodies, right? And it releases acetylcholine. So this is a cholinergic synapse. This will excite, remember, acetylcholine excited, this will excite the postganglionic neuron. And in the sympathetic nervous system, the release of it, what gets released is norepinephrine / epinephrine. We'll talk about that later. Norepinephrine gets released as the neurotransmitter. So this is an adrenergic synapse. If I go back, acetylcholine, cholinergic, adrenergic, right? So in the sympathetic, we release norepinephrine. There's a special case, if you don't want to think of it too much now, there's a special case of the sympathetic nervous system where the preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, which stimulates the adrenal medulla here, a special ganglia, technically, to release epinephrine and norepinephrine all in the blood vessels, and this gets circulated around the entire body. This will stimulate all the organs, right? So sympathetic, right? Sympathetic neurons release norepinephrine and epinephrine, and the name for this is the adrenergic synapses. An adrenaline rush, right? You've heard of that name maybe. That means stress, like when you're stressed to bungee jump or something like that. So this sympathetic branch, this is the adrenaline rush. This is epinephrine and norepinephrine that gets released. So this would cause the stress response. So if I asked you, what does norepinephrine and epinephrine do? I can't really say it excites or it inhibits, right? Let's go back over here to what it does. In the sympathetic division, right, it might excite the heart to accelerate. It might excite the bronchi to dilate, but it will inhibit saliva production. It will inhibit the stomach and the GI organs, right? So it depends where it is. Basically, this will probably be sent everywhere in the blood since it's going into the blood circulation too. But it depends where it goes to, right? But I want you to know that in the sympathetic nervous system, the final target, what these organs will see, is epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? And that's what's going to trigger the stress response. It's going to bind to these targets and cause heart to increase, GI to decrease, salivary glands to decrease, right? All of these things that are in a stress response. Note that acetylcholine was what got put onto the from the preganglionic to the postganglionic just to excite this other neuron. It was just the intermediate step. Acetylcholine here is just the intermediate step to tell the adrenal gland to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. In the parasympathetic system, right? A neuron comes out, it releases acetylcholine, as was the case here, and it releases it onto the postganglionic neuron, as was the case here. But this parasympathetic set releases acetylcholine onto the targets. So when this fires, acetylcholine gets released, and that will have its effects on the targets. Is this acetylcholine going to excite or inhibit? It'll do a bit of both. Again, let's go see. Acetylcholine will stimulate, excite salivary gland contraction, but it'll go and slow the heart rate down, right? Inhibit the heart. It'll stimulate the stomach, liver, all of these things, right? But it slows down the heart. So it depends what tissue it goes to. They have different effects, right? So let's just read what I wrote here. All preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine to excite postganglionic. Here I have a preganglionic neuron. It sends acetylcholine to excite. Here I have a preganglionic. It excites with acetylcholine. Preganglionic excites with acetylcholine. Dual innervation coordinates antagonizing effects. So, for example, when the sympathetic neuron excites something, usually the parasympathetic will inhibit, right? Sympathetic postganglionic neurons are long, and their cell bodies exist in special ganglia, right? And they release norepinephrine and epinephrine. That's what they release onto their targets. Parasympathetic, they release acetylcholine onto their effectors, right? So that's the main key takeaway. We stimulate the sympathetic, we're going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. We stimulate the parasympathetic system, we release acetylcholine, okay? Now, you're going to tell me, how is it that this norepinephrine and epinephrine could go and stimulate the heart, but then relax the stomach, right? How is it that it could do both? It's the same neurotransmitter. The effects of the neurotransmitter depend on the type of receptor they bind to. Effectors have different receptors. This gets confusing, but I want you to take 2 little seconds. All I need you to know is that some receptors bind acetylcholine. Some are nicotinic and some are muscarinic, right? So nicotinic receptors, over here, wherever you see acetylcholine released, right? Where is acetylcholine? Here acetylcholine is released, you see nicotinic receptors, N. Here you see acetylcholine released, you see nicotinic. Here you see acetylcholine, nicotinic. So these are nicotinic receptors. Here it's epinephrine, so never mind, or epinephrine. Here you see acetylcholine release, you see a muscarinic receptor, right? Here you see acetylcholine release, you see nicotinic or muscarinic receptors. So basically, the receptor that acetylcholine binds to could be nicotinic or it could be muscarinic, right? So by changing these receptors, you could have different effects based on where you are in the body, okay? You don't need to know the details of this. I just need you to know that acetylcholine could bind to either of these, and it could inhibit or it could increase. And that's how that same neurotransmitter has different effects on the heart versus the stomach. Because probably the heart and the stomach, they each have a different, one has probably nicotinic, the other probably has muscarinic. So they have different effects. So cholinergic receptors, they bind acetylcholine. This could be the receptor, nicotinic, or it could be muscarinic. What are the adrenergic receptors that bind norepinephrine and epinephrine? Norepi and epi will bind to beta receptors or alpha receptors, okay? These are adrenergic receptors. So here, whenever you see epinephrine or norepinephrine, you see alpha and beta receptors. That's the receptors that they could bind to. And there's many different subtypes that you do not need to know. But again, norepinephrine will stimulate the heart, but it will relax the stomach, right? So how does it do that? Well, the heart and the stomach probably have different receptor types and will have different effects, right? Because the same neurotransmitter binds onto it, there must be something different, right? So that's how we can modulate our effect. So actually, maybe if you're watching some Grey's Anatomy, and they'll when someone's having some problems with their heart, they'll talk about things called beta blockers. There are meds that actually block the beta receptors so that you could control and try to increase heart rate. They're blocking one of the sympathetic or parasympathetic branches. You don't need to know which is which, but I want you to understand that basically we have all these different types of receptors that also could help change the effect of the neurotransmitter. So let me just summarize what these two slides are crazy, okay? But I just, again, the only thing I want you to know is that cholinergic synapses, right, that release acetylcholine, they'll bind onto one of these two receptors, and adrenergic receptors, adrenergic neurons, which are norepinephrine or epinephrine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, they will go and release norepi and epi onto beta or alpha receptors on their target, okay? So basically all this to say, excitatory and inhibitory effects of neurotransmitters during a sympathetic activation, postganglionic neurons mostly release norepinephrine and epinephrine. And these adrenergic neurons, they excite the heart, they excite the lungs and the skeletal muscle, but they inhibit non-critical activities like digestion and urination. During parasympathetic activation, postganglionic neurons mostly release acetylcholine that excite most glands to increase digestive and urinary processes. They inhibit sympathetic activities like heart and breathing rates, right? So it's the opposite in parasympathetic. And that is that. You have some nice review questions, and that is the end.